In Hugh McDermott's poetry, cultures and languages meet and interact, exchanging perspectives, insight, and creativity. We've heard quite a bit today about where he gets this language and these languages from. I guess I'm more interested for now in how he uses them. I'm going to explore McDermott's approach to language as an archipelagic approach, hopefully drawing some helpful connections between McDermott's time in Shetland and the vision of world language which he proposes in Memoriam James Joyce. In his borrowing of language, his attempts at synthesis and his juxtaposition of linguistic forms, McDermott suggests and instigates what Thompson denotes as fluid movement across porous margins, a key characteristic recognised in an archipelagic philosophy. The period of productive isolation, which he spent on Wolsey in Shetland in 1933 to 42, and his travels from here to other Scottish islands saw McDermott retreat into what John Brannigan has referred to as geographical areas which have remained remote from the encroachments of a debilitating English modernity. Through this, McDermott developed an archipelagic perspective which celebrated plurality and savoured the languages of local knowledge and particularity, collectively opposed to the invasion of standard English and imperialist oppression. This built upon his navigation of a Gaelic idea in the 1930s and the focus on Celticness, which persists in later work, guided by a belief in maintaining an alternative to the other because it is all part of the richness of life. Whilst each language which McDermott references and borrows from might symbolise the distinctiveness of a singular island, the world language which he envisions in Memoriam James Joyce in 1955 resembles the collective, the archipelago. In McDermott's vision, both specificity and commonality are central, ideas that I will focus on today. In his Stony Limits poetry in 1934, which was directly informed by the Shetland experience, and in the islands of Scotland in 1939, the Scottish archipelago is a recognisable and distinct influence upon McDermott's creative project. However, the idea of seeing Scotland, if not Britain, Europe, and the world, as an archipelago transpires far earlier. It does so most notably in 1924, when McDermott, writing as J.G. Outerstone Buglass, quotes himself in imagining that there was no England and never had been, and Scotland was, like Ireland, an island off the coast of Europe. Scotland, he continues, is coterminous with the universe, foregrounding, through emphasis upon Scotland's coastal borders with the continent, the intrinsic connectedness of island experience, defined less by its grounded isolation and more by its watery reaches out to the rest of the world. In Penny Week, 1926, McDermott also includes adaptations of 3 short Cretan poems, Under the Greenwood Tree, which we heard Patrick mention earlier today, The 3 Fishes and The Robber. His recourse to Cretan poetry is perhaps a nod to his experience in Salonika and the war, and his imagination of the Greek land and seascapes that lay beyond his limited freedoms on the Western Front. Yet that's as far as islands really reach in McDermott's consciousness, until his move to Shetland in the 1930s. McDermott considered his relocation to the Northern Archipelago in 1933 to be a virtual expatriation, having inserted physical distance between himself and the nation as he knew it. It was a case of so near and yet so far, immersion in an alternative Scottish experience and identity, which, whilst far in space, remained no further from the centre of things, no further from the great warm heart of humanity. Shetland, referred to as a burnt-out star, introduced McDermott to distinct forms of Scottish language other than his familiar Lowland Scots, English, or even Gaelic. This concern is most famously present in On a Raised Beach, as McDermott includes Norn within the various linguistic approaches that he trials in an attempt to understand the austere natural environment of Shetland's rocky landscapes. In adopting Norn, which declined following Scotland's acquisition of Shetland and Orkney from Norway in the mid-15th century, and which was considered to be extinct by the mid-19th century, McDermott acknowledges the scale of deep geological time throughout which the environment has adapted and shaped itself. Norn is trialled because of its particularity, as we see in the extract beginning here. I try with the old Norn words. Knowledge of the local landscape is indicated as being built into the language which grows out of it, and thus McDermott uses it as a tool with which to access understanding and to get into the stones. Within the poem, however, in which definitions are not provided, the vocabulary becomes more rhythmic and musical, a language without recognisable words. sound prefaces meaning, and the speaker in the poem must rely on their basic senses to navigate their environment, trusting that their openness to the unknown will pay off. McDermott returns to this local ecological authority of Norn in Memoriam James Joyce, as he invokes the vocabulary within his patchwork of languages related to particular localities, cultures, and applications. Consider this in the extract quoted here, which begins, or even as in the Shetland Islands where I lived, I know in the Old Norn language the various names applied to all the restless movements of the sea. And then he gives us a catalogue: D, da mother D, soul, trove, hack, burrick, bod, brim, and so on. The context of this poem is not local in the same way as Honoré's Beach was, and yet it's propelled by the same desire to move beyond oneself and to attune to foreign forms of expression. As opposed to the existential uncertainty of Honoré's Beach, the poetic voice of In Memoriam asserts its vision more securely, confident in its utilisation of the unfamiliar vocabulary, as illustrated by the explicit provision of definitions here, an intentional proposition of knowledge, understanding, and reliability. McDermott's experimentation with Norn is complemented by his evident reverence for the working class people of Shetland who utilise a local dialect within modern conditions. McDermott writes from an attachment to place that Nicholas Allen has considered to be symptomatic of archipelagic writing, locally grounded, but at the same time involved in a network of cultural exchange. He purposefully picks up language and ideas from those around him, as we've heard quite a bit about today. And in Shetland, his attempts to write a poetry that would do the Shetland fisherman justice results in the Shetland lyrics, published in Stony Limits, which are snapshots of island living and contemplation. In some of the lyrics, such as With the Herring Fishers, McDermott includes dialogue which he might have encountered whilst out on the boats. Swim on, bonny heron, swim on, they shout, or come in, oh come in and see me. Other lyrics, such as Colliforth in winter or De Profundis, capture the barrenness of the seascape when not in the presence of the Shetlanders. And I quote here from De Profundis, I delight in this nothingness more than ever I did, in the creation it yielded and has aimed. In the absence of the locals, their experience, their speech, their language, McDermott's Shetland is populated by birds and the movements of the seas. It's a distance from human culture, but it's not a complete isolation from the world. The seas and oceans, as well as the coast and the land, serve as an integral space within McDermott's assertion of a holistic national identity and his proposition of a planetary consciousness, guided by the connection between solitude and universality. And then it's from Shetland, of course, that McDermott embarks upon the island travels which inform his 1939 Batsford travel guide to the islands of Scotland, a reinforcement of archipelagic plurality within this universal network. We might relate his findings here to Chris Bonge's recognition of the island as, on the one hand, the absolutely particular, a space complete unto itself, and thus an ideal metaphor for a traditionally conceived unified and unitary identity, on the other as a fragment, a part of some greater whole from which it is in exile and to which it must be related. McDermott approaches the islands by sea, a space which Brannigan encourages us to think of as a space of connection and communication, and which proves key to his understanding of the archipelago as a framework of journeys and flux. It's such travel and movement within this, which Alexander Campbell considers to have fueled McDermott's emergent archipelagic poetics that emphasises interconnection and interaction. In the Islands of Scotland, McDermott writes that Scotland is broken up into islands other than, and to a far greater extent than merely geographically. But what does this mean? The Islands of Scotland is overwhelmingly an affirmation of diversity and unity, considered within Scotland as a microcosm of the world. He surveys their differences in the way in which they relate to one another, writing that they are of all shapes and sizes. No symmetry of effect is obtainable. She seems to have no control over them. Several groups appear to have escaped from and concerted movement of which she is the centre altogether. And while some remain in groups, others are isolated stragglers. It is a chaotic spectacle seen from above. Authority is not imposed upon the islands from above, remaining a chaotic spectacle despite belonging to a wider system. The islands are autonomous, representative of a devolved power and unique separate identities, and McDermott recognises in them an alternative to the imperial framework of authority and organisation. By remaining attentive to these minute distinctions, for which he claims to have a Scottish love, Campbell argues that McDermott avoids the production of homogenizing narratives of place, retaining an element of local particularity, which remains key to his vision of world language. He asserts through this that in order to know any island, it is necessary to know many islands, a prelude of sorts to the sentiment of In Memoriam James Joyce, that a language is a form of life, but there are many forms of life. Plurality is central to both. We see this in the second quote here as well. They are not endless, these variations of form, though it is perhaps impossible to see them all. It is certainly impossible to conceive one that doesn't exist. The languages which McDermott incorporates within In Memoriam, invoked to counteract the transmissive necessity of the poem's English, are presented as individually distinct and yet connected, autonomous and yet cooperative. The smallest are incorporated and celebrated alongside the most expansive, the centres of authority, as well as the isolated stragglers. His vision is concerned at one moment with the whole of world literature and equally concerned the next with Vogel, the smallest of the Finno-Ugrian language group, spoken by only 5,000 people. It too is a chaotic spectacle seen from above, an impenetrable seeming archipelago of vocabulary, referentiality and understanding, which McDermott refuses to prescribe a simplified order or hierarchy upon. The size of a language is taken as no indicator of its value, the smallest components representative of the most specific and distinctive experiences and identities which ought to be retained and supported. And McDermott's also interested in the way that languages affect one another within this, how they are similar to Elizabeth de Lowry's description of islands as vital and dynamic loci of cultural and material exchange. Thus, we see references to Creole languages within his worldly vision. For instance, Papiamento, a Caribbean Creole influenced by Spanish, English, Dutch, and African as a result of imperial slave trades, which McDermott cites as a mixture of half the languages on earth. This is also how we end up with a passage like this, in which, borrowing from more knowledgeable linguistic sources, presumably, McDermott incorporates contemplation of both the links and differentiations between Britain's Celtic languages and the dialects which they consist of. We see connections drawn between Breton, Gaulish, Spanish, Welsh, French, and so on, a complex network which begins in Scotland, moves outwards to the British Isles, to Western Europe, and eventually reaches beyond. Later on in the poem, it's a similar concern which sees McDermott end the poem as he does, quoted here. With this consideration of local variations of pronunciation across South America, language is highlighted as it lives and changes in speech. It's inherited and adapted throughout history in a trajectory which is recognized as continuing long beyond the limits of the poem. But this is all something to discuss further another date. The challenge of redressing historic tensions between imposed imperial languages, i.e. English, and the diverse suppressed native languages of colonized regions is a central concern in Memoriam, which decentralizes expected linguistic authority and destabilizes English through the relentless injection of foreign elements. In archipelagic terms, to represent the mainland is not enough in itself, while the distinctive island and marginal characters contribute to a holistic understanding of its tradition or culture. McDermott calls upon a cacophony of voices, expressions, and cultures in the poem in a rejection of standardization, arguing that all dreams of imperialism must be exercised, including linguistic imperialism, which sums up all the rest. In this context, the initiation of interaction and exchange between languages, which McDermott visualizes in the poem, suggests a collective and anti-imperialist stance. The languages are connected despite their differences, much like the invisible bridges which he saw as linking every one of the Scottish islands. The bricolage or mosaic approach which McDermott adopts throughout much of In Memoriam helps to ensure that this distinctiveness of each individual element is retained, the momentum of the poem propelled onward by the pursuit of an agreement or cooperation between them. While he himself might have intended for an effect of interpenetration, it was Edwin Morgan who aptly argued that it was more suited to being described as collage, a practice of organization rather than creation or neologism. The poem might also be described as an epic exercise in heteroglossia and polyphony. the Bakhtinian concepts of coexisting linguistic variations within a single language, and the literary utilization of these variations. Bakhtin's theory of dialectics was primarily confined to the discourse of the novel, but McDermott experiments with how the poem might operate as a subjectively constructed hybrid space in which languages do not exclude each other, but rather intersect with each other in many different ways. In doing so, he highlights the necessity of collaboration and collectivity, expressed through language, but pertaining to deeper socialist values and the achievement of change. His polyphonic language, envisioned within the poem, represents a hybridity and the inhabitation of multiple cultural worlds, which Ramazani argues is not an aspect, but the basic fabric of the post-colonial poem. Collectivized against the homogenizing heavyweight of standard English, the plurality of languages used and referenced in memoriam also serve a purpose which Susan Stanford Friedman has recognized in the collage poem more generally, the defamiliarization that what we take for granted is universal. McDermott's approach then, a polyphonic archipelago, I've said that word too many times, archipelago, which groups languages yet falls short of imposing any authoritative order, intentionally challenges global hierarchies of power and expression, a disruptive vision which breaks from the current trajectory he perceives society to be on. Now, I hope this idea of the archipelago has helped to visualize the priorities, which I understand to have informed McDermott's vision of world language in Memoriam James Joyce. Much as he had perceived in Shetland and as he had witnessed on his travels around the Scottish coast, the key to finding a shared expression and identity was a dual emphasis on plurality and particularity, navigated and proposed within a fluid, decentralized space of collaboration and exchange. It was a vision which was, in degrees, both idealistic and limited, yet it drew upon the sure reality of the world's geographies and communities, and its affirmation of the centrality of language within the human experience as communication, expression, understanding, and authority continues to resonate. And that's enough for today. Thank you for listening.